Hi, this is Michael from The Intersection. Now, for each of our episodes, we'll be following up the first segment with an interview with an expert on the topic. Our special guest is musician and composer Keyna Wilkins. She has done some extraordinary collaborations with refugees held in detention. One of those collaborations, the 2021 album Set Me Free, recorded with Iranian poet Jalal Mohammadi, is one of the best Australian releases of the last few years. We started our interview by asking Keyna how this project started.
Well, for a long time, I've been a passionate refugee supporter. And I've kind of been working, I guess, on the fringes, like volunteering for Amnesty International and various refugee advocacy groups around Sydney. But then it was at the beginning of COVID, where, because I'm a musician and I'm also a teacher. So usually I've also got twins. So usually I'm super busy. But then at the beginning of COVID, suddenly, no gigs. And suddenly everyone basically had no projects on, or, heavily delayed projects. And I was actually looking for something to work on, to kind of occupy myself with. And then this poet called Jalal Mohammadi posted some of his poetry and art on a refugee advocacy page on Facebook. And it just really spoke to me straight away. I just thought, wow, that is so powerful. And I contacted him and I said, hey, I really like your poetry. I'd love to, well, the initial plan was, I said, I'd love to turn it into an opera. And he goes, oh, wow, thank you. And then as we kind of got chatting, I realized, I couldn't believe it to start with, but I realized, oh my goodness, this is actually his story. He was communicating on Facebook via his detention cell. So he'd been in detention for 9 years, including 6 years on Nauru, the infamous Nauru. And so in total, he'd been in detention for 9 years, even though he had committed no crimes and he had never been charged by the Australian government. I realized, wow, this is from the horse's mouth. So there's lots of reasons I decided to take on this project. Firstly, I believe he's very talented. Secondly, I wanted to raise awareness. And thirdly, I wanted our voices together to create something new. And by this point, we were talking quite regularly, and I was trying to help them in lots of different ways, because a lot of them are just obviously in incredibly desperate situations because they've been told they will never get out of prison. They're in indefinite detention. So he was very, very mentally not well. So then I just kind of started thinking, his voice is quite naturally musical, and I thought, how about we just record his voice speaking the poems? And we had a little jam together, like he was speaking his poems and I was playing music, improvising around him. And I just thought, you know what, this works really well. And that's kind of how the whole idea came about. And then because we were getting a little bit of attention for it as I was speaking about it to my friends and stuff, I thought, well, why not involve more musicians? Because, as you know, the more musicians are involved in a project, the more people are going to talk about it. So basically, by the end of a few months, there was 19 musicians involved from all over Australia. They would improvise tracks from their homes, sent them in. I had pieced it together with Jalal's voice. Now, I recorded him speaking 12 of his poems via Zoom from his prison cell. So we had to get it in between, like the guards were coming by and stuff like that, and we had to stop, and we had to wait for him to have total privacy, so it took quite a long time. But we did it because he's actually sharing a room at all times with, well, obviously he's out now, which is fantastic. But he was sharing a room with 3 other people, so privacy was a really big problem, and getting the quiet time to do that was challenging. But we did it, and then we had a big album launch in Marrickville. So this is when he was in detention, and we sold out Lazy Bones. There was about 150 people there. The head of Amnesty International spoke at the event, and we got everyone to write letters to the then Minister Alex Hawke. Karen Andrews, Home Affairs Minister, and Immigration Minister Alex Hawke, and Scott Morrison. So people were emailing all of those people. 2 weeks later, he was released. So it was absolutely incredible. And I got lots of really positive attention from ABC, from Sydney Morning Herald. I'd really pushed all of my contacts to kind of raise awareness of the situation, really. And also, I think the musicians who contributed to it really put their heart and soul into the improvisations. Now, I played flute and piano. I did one solo flute piece, one solo piano piece, and then I played flute on a bunch of other pieces as well, but altogether it was 12 tracks and 19 musicians, and I pieced it all together on my computer. And then I also got a professional sound engineer, Matt Stewart, to kind of fine tune it to make it actually sound good, which was great. And so that's how it all
certainly does. It's a
started.
beautifully produced record.
Thank you so much. We got some great reviews. We got some great reviews from New York, Scotland, Europe, and it all helps to raise awareness of the plight. And what I'm relieved about is that it does feel like public opinion is gradually shifting.
Am I correct in thinking that Jalal's detention was because he came here via boat at the time that the laws changed over?
Correct. So he had friends that came just a few months before him that were in detention for 2 weeks and then were let out. And obviously they're given terrible visas. I mean, they're always given terrible visas where they're not allowed to study. And a lot of the sometimes they're not allowed access to Medicare. So, the government puts them in situations where it's very hard for them to better themselves. But, they make a red hot go of it. And a lot of them become very successful and, massive contributors to society and all that. So he had friends that came just a few months before, got straight through, even relatives. But then when he was actually on the boat from Indonesia to Australia, that's when the law changed. A lot of them were very shocked. They really because I got to know, I mean, through the whole project with Jalal, I got to know a lot of other people that were in the prison with him in Brisbane. So he was one of the Medivac refugees. So when I was speaking to him, he was actually in the Brisbane detention centre. But so I got to know a bunch of them there, and it was a big shock, the whole process. And as I said, they've been in prison for 9 years. A lot of them never been charged, never been put on trial. And it was because they arrived by boat. Now, if they arrive by plane, they get straight through into the community. And really, all you can really kind of surmise from that is racism, because the ones that come by boat generally tend to come from a different part of the world.
From memory, that was sort of the dying days of the Rudd government as well. So there was perhaps a little bit of electioneering involved.
100%. Yeah, 100%. Yeah, so through that process, obviously I was like absolutely euphoric when he got released 2 weeks after. And then I thought, I have to find others as well to try to help raise the profile of, because, maybe I can help in some way. It was very exciting. So then in the following months, I collaborated with a further 5 talented refugees. A lot of them that are left are men. There was only like 1 woman left on Nauru and 90 men, something like that. Right. Partially because the Australian government arbitrarily releases them without explaining why. And I think they know that there tends to be a little bit more sympathy for women and children, so they tend to let out them first. So there was just these very unlucky bunch of men left.
From listening to Set Me Free, it was obvious at times where Jalal is basically whispering, which at first struck me that, okay, he's trying to avoid being noticed, or he's in a crowded room, etc. That also brings a real intensity to those tracks. As soon as I hear that, it's just you're almost transported and you know what's happening at the time, the position he's in.
Look, that's right. We experimented with a lot of different ways of him talking. I think it's very effective. I think whispering in general is very, very effective, but also the way he whispers, it's very much from the heart.
So as a listener, I mean, that's intense, but how was it for you at times as a composer when you would get these poems? You've got some very heavy material at times, and knowing that you've got to sit there and write and arrange music for it. How do you personally deal with that?
When I first started talking to him, I was crying every day.
Yeah.
I was crying. I was in floods of tears every day. I just couldn't believe what had happened to him. It was really his whole life, I mean, as soon as they're a refugee, they've been heavily persecuted, and basically the whole country has been bullying them right from when he was born. So his family was subject to land seizures in Iran, where his whole family had lived for generations. Suddenly the Iranian government said, "We've found oil here, you have to leave." And they basically paid them a pittance for their whole house, because they were Arab Awazi, which were a minority group. Then going to Indonesia, getting on the boat in Indonesia, pretty high chance of drowning, really. But of course they feel it's worth it. And then, not to mention the treatment on Nauru was absolutely horrific. It was absolutely shocking the way that he was all of them, the way that all of them were treated. I mean, they have basically tiny, ineffectual hospitals that basically just give out Panadol, regular beatings from locals, because there's no attempt by the Australian government to integrate the community. And there's a lot of, clashes. A lot of them have been beaten up at least a few times. So, sometimes they have very, very bad headwinds and all kinds of stuff. And there's no doctor to see them, or it takes a very long time to get a doctor to try and figure out what's wrong with them. So yeah, there's a lot of really, severe neglect going on there. So he got released 18 months ago, and he's just recently gone to Canada, actually, because he was part of a refugee program application process to get into Canada, because they have a community sponsorship scheme. So the way the system works is they have to find 5 Canadian citizens who are happy to sponsor that person, help them set up their life and help them find accommodation, work, help them set up a bank account and all that. And they basically put it on the responsibility of the Canadian citizens, but there's a whole kind of network called the Northern Lights Foundation, which is set up in Canada, which is very, very effective at getting all this set up. So I guess he, he's trying to kind of start his life completely again there. Even when they're let out of detention here, they're given these terrible visas, which really limits them. Like, it pushes them into underclass work, really. And so, and some of them are mentally functional and they're able to exist like that. But some of them have very, very bad PTSD. Well, most of them have PTSD and anxiety, depression, all that kind of stuff. And it's very scary when they first get out, because the other problem is, because they're given no warning of when they're going to get out, it's a massive shock when they do. In the case of Jalal, suddenly he was released and he had an hour to say goodbye to all these people that he'd been living with for 2 years. And what a lot of them talk about is how they haven't crossed a road for years, stuff like that. So, and then hearing Australian voices, they're like, oh no, are they going to, put me in handcuffs? Because that's how they're transported, is actually sometimes in the middle of the night in handcuffs, is how they're taken from A to B to avoid the protesters at the airports. So it's a really shocking existence they've had up to this point. So yeah, it's very challenging when they come out, so it's very challenging for them.
Keyna, can you tell us some more about your other collaborations with refugees?
I've also collaborated with Mehdi Ali, who was a refugee in detention for 9 years, who ended up getting quite famous because he was in the same hotel as Djokovic was held.
Oh,
15 months ago. Yeah. So he was only 16 when he arrived on Nauru, and now then at the time that we did the collaboration, he was 24 anyway. And he was held in the same detention center as Djokovic, and because the entire international media was on this detention center, which was in the middle of Melbourne, all the refugees there started hanging massive banners everywhere saying, do you realize there's refugees in here that have been held here for 9 years with no trial, no charge, we're in indefinite detention. And then suddenly, and actually Mehdi was really one of the only ones that was brave enough to actually speak to media, because a lot of them were worried that there'd be some kind of punishment, which there often is from the Australian guards. So they had a very real fear that they would throw away the key and never let them out if they spoke to the media about it. But Mehdi just thought, fuck that, this has been too much now. And he played a little bit of a dangerous game, but because he was so brave and because he was so good at speaking, he actually trumped everyone, because he ended up having 50 or 60 interviews all over Australia. He ended up having someone manage his interview schedule. It was BBC, it was Brazil, it was Italy, it was China, it was Russia Today, it was Al Jazeera. It literally every 2 hours, he was on some massive, TV station. And then he was released 4 weeks later with his cousin.
Again, timing.
Yeah,
Interesting. And
yeah.
so
And
is Mehdi
so
a
finally,
writer?
he's actually a brilliant musician. You should definitely look him up. But
Okay.
he's also a poet, and I did the same thing as I did with Jalal. I recorded him speaking his poem, which is called Brown Nails, and I wrote a piano piece to it. And we were going to do more collaborations, but then he got released. And him and his cousin actually, their application came through to be accepted into America. Now, they actually had been accepted years before that, but the Australian government hadn't released them. So suddenly they were released after all this media attention.
Sorry, they'd already been accepted into
Yeah,
America and the Australian
yeah,
government wouldn't let them go.
yeah. That's what they do
Funny.
because they want it to, oh, it's shocking. They want it to be a deterrent to other people from those communities. So Adnan, who is Mehdi's cousin, and Mehdi had been accepted, like, I think at least 2 years before. They kept getting stonewalled when they said, well, when exactly are we going? Because, certainly not the Americans are happy to have us anytime. Yeah, no, but they do that all the time. So yeah, and it's really, really disgusting human behavior, the way these people are treated.
And what are some of the other collaborations you've been working on?
Yeah, so I'll just talk about two of the other ones. So one of them is this guy called Halal Uddin, who is a Bangladeshi refugee who was held on Manus Island. He has a bit of a complicated story, but basically he ended up having a relationship and marriage to a local Manus lady, and they had a child. And he wanted to live with her. It was kind of like an open prison they were in before that. And then the authorities found out, and they deported him, but then he wanted to be back with his son, so he tried to get back, and they threw him straight in jail. They threw him straight into Bamana prison, which is widely believed to be one of the worst prisons in the world. So they have stone beds, and he hadn't seen his son in 2 years, but he used to be a professional cook, and when he was in the prison, he had the special job of being a cook for the whole prison. Because the food they were given was just a little bit of rice and fish every day. That's the only food they were given. So he kind of set up this kind of community where he would get donations from Australians and buy lots of fresh fruit and vegetables, and then cook food for all 60 prisoners. It was like this kind of like fusion cuisine, and he basically started writing down all of his recipes, and his Amnesty International are going to be publishing a book of his recipes later this year. So it's going to be called A Spicy Life, and his name is Halal Uddin. Now he also sings, and he wrote a song and recorded it just on his phone, sent it to me. Basically what I've done is I've improvised a flute line around it, and I've slightly rearranged some of it. So his name is Halal Uddin, and now he has also been released. It was a bit of a shocking kind of situation as well with him in the end, because he was in Bamana prison. They were waiting for this court case, but then COVID happened, and then the judge died, something like that. Anyway, he was waiting for 3 years in Bamana prison, waiting for a verdict to see if he could just get out of Bamana prison, even into the normal Manus Island prison, and see his son for 3 years. And eventually, unfortunately, the verdict was no, and he got deported again. Then, because he is a refugee in his own community, he's blacklisted by authorities and so on. They had to go straight into hiding. I don't think he'd have a problem with me saying all this. And then eventually he got out, and now he just literally like 3 weeks ago, he got accepted into New Zealand.
And do you see this advocacy for yourself that you're doing, or this musical advocacy as well, that's something you're continuing with?
Yeah, absolutely. So I guess number one for me is I'm a professional composer and musician, and I run a lot of projects. And for me, the number one thing is, do you have an interesting story? For me, I feel like I can write the best music and I can have the best projects when it's an interesting, engaging story. All these people have that straight away. So like from an artistic perspective, you've got all the bones there of something really quite epic, And then, of course, the also it raises awareness of a very important cause, massive injustice. So all those reasons. Now, there's another poet I was collaborating with also who is held in Brisbane Detention Centre called Mohammad Maleki. Now, he, for many years, he's had a lot of his poetry published. He's won a couple of awards as well while he was on Manus. He's been published by Verity La. He also had a book launch in October, I think, last year, and he's actually had a few events all around Brisbane. And so I've used one of his poems for a piece that I was commissioned to write for a cellist in Spain. And she's going to be performing it all around Spain next year. And that's based on his poem Exit. So she's going to be performing the piece and speaking the poem at the same time. And, through that, she has to speak about what the poem's about at all of her concerts. When I spoke about it, she couldn't believe this was happening in a country like Australia. I said, well, keep it quiet, didn't they? They try to keep it quiet. Spain has its own issues with refugees, but she said nothing like that. They don't put them in jail. Then I'm also working on an opera, which I've already written. I already wrote an opera 5 years ago with somebody called Mikhail Imielski. And it's about, funnily enough, this is even before I met these refugees, it's about a human refugee leaving planet Earth, looking for it's a sci-fi, right? A sci-fi opera. And then after reading Mohammed's work, I thought, me and Mikhail were talking, we thought, why not kind of put all this together? Why not make this really epic, like from the horse's mouth? Let's get get the real thing here, the real deal. So what we're doing is we're reworking it and putting Mohammed's poetry in, and he's got some absolutely beautiful epic poetry as well.
Keyna, where can we go online to find out more about these artists who you're working with?
Thank you for asking that. So my website is keynawilkins.com. That's KEYNAWILKINS.com. And I have a page on that called Refugee Collaborations. As I mentioned, I've collaborated with 6 refugees altogether. I highly recommend looking up individually the poet and artist Jalal Mohammadi. He is on social media as well. So that's JALAL MAHAMEDE. I also recommend looking up Mehdi Ali. That's MEHDI Ali. He's on Instagram and Twitter. I highly recommend watching out for Helal Udin's cookbook brought out by Amnesty International, which we hopefully publish later this year. And finally, I want to lead us into the next track, which is called Silence Lands by Mohammad Maleki. That is MOHAMMAD Now, he is an Iranian poet who was held on Manus Island and in Australian detention centres for a total of 9 years. And he's had a number of his poems published. He's currently been released. He's living in Brisbane on a very, very terrible visa. And he suffered this really quite astonishing injustice from the Australian government. And it's a real honour for him to trust me to set his work to music. Now, this one you're about to hear, it's called Silence Lands. Now, this one was recorded via Zoom from his prison cell. I did write a piano piece to it. It's also on YouTube with a lot of images of him and a bit more about his story. So please feel free to look it up. I'm also doing the opera collaboration with him and also the collaboration with the cellist in Spain with using his work. So feel free to look it up. Thank you so much.
I have thoughts about my sanity. Not everyone can bear this much. They store all my feelings. There is no wisdom left in my mind. I am just a walking dead man. I yelled for help so many times. No one on this earth took my hand. Now I see many mad things and imagine how the world would look if it collapsed. Perhaps it would be good for everything to return to the past, for nothing to be seen on the earth or in the sky. It would feel so good to be a child again and go back to my mother's womb. For there to be no sign of me, for me never to have gone crazy in this place. What if the woolen jacket I am wearing unravels and begins to fall apart? Or the butterfly flies back to its cocoon, or the autumn leaf grows giddy and returns to its branch on that old tree. What if the tree becomes a seed in the soil? I sound crazy speaking this way. It's the outcome of being detained for 9 years. What if that seed returned to its source and flowed back to the river mouth? If that river receded back up into its spring? What if only the sun and the moon remain in the sky? If I saw even the sun, the river, and watched it disappear into space, witness the moon implode upon itself. All things returning to their starting place. How beautiful to live colorless world everywhere, silent and still. The earth would become for a moment free of even one miscarriage. But what do you make of my vision? Am I sane or mad?
And that was Silence Land by Keyna Wilkins along with Mohammad, Maleki and Hassam Safai. Thank you to Keyna Wilkins for joining us. And thank you for listening to The Intersection. My name is Michael Fisher, production by Rob Margenberg. We'd like to give special thanks to Eastside Radio, 89.7 FM. You can contact us via email at theintersection@eastsidefm.org. And don't forget to follow The Intersection on social media. You can follow us on Facebook, Twitter or Instagram. Just search _Eastside FM. The Intersection was recorded on Gadigal land. Sovereignty never ceded.